She was 19 and evicted. No family left to take her in, no roof of her own, just a small carved alderwood smoking shed key carved warm by 4 generations of women's hands. A single thumbed page from her Bestimore's Cannery book sewn into the lining of her brown canvas barn coat pocket. And 7 single-dollar bills she had earned washing fish totes on the cold concrete floor of a small commercial dock outside Ilwaco. And with that $7, she bought a half-collapsed waterfront salmon cannery on Pilchuck Slough Road in the small Norwegian-American fishing village of Pilchuck Slough in Pacific County, Washington, in a stretch of the lower Columbia River salmon coast that had not heard the slow, steady draw of alderwood smoke through a cedar smoking room rack since the autumn of 1963. The hand-cut cedar clapboard siding had silvered and split along the river face. The cedar shake roof of the long, low cannery had collapsed slow along the east slope, packed inside a hand-built alderwood chest that her Bestimore's Bestimore had set down with her own 2 hands across the last 128 years of the cannery's life, was something that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had grown up with the smell of fresh-caught Columbia River Chinook and slow alderwood smoke, with the deep, clean, briny smell of fresh-caught Columbia River Chinook salmon loaded slow into a cedar fish tote on a cool September morning, with the dry, sharp smell of seasoned alderwood coals burning slow in the small brick smoking room firebox on a cold October morning, with the cool, clean smell of fresh rinsed cedar smoking room racks being laid slow across the long hand-pegged cedar smoking room frames, with the warm amber smell of beeswax being rubbed slow into the carved alderwood handle of a long smoking rack hook to keep the wood from cracking in the river damp, and with the deep, cool dusk smell of the lower Columbia River salmon coast itself, breathing slow off the Pilchuck Slough on a warm August evening, briny and old and full of years. She had grown up sitting on a low cedar stool inside the long low cedar smoking room of her Bestimore's salmon cannery when she was 3 and 4 years old, watching her Bestimore's long brown spotted hands draw a long alderwood smoking rack hook slow across the loose laid cedar smoking room racks spread thin with split Chinook fillets, turning the fillets with a slow patience that did not look like work but like listening. Her Bestimore was Sigrid Sorensen, born in 1938 in the same small white-painted clapboard cannery cottage at the foot of Pilchuck Slough Road, where Linnea would later be born, the only daughter of Magnus and Astrid Sorensen. She had learned the smoking room and the alderwood hook at the side of her own mother on the same long cedar smoking room racks and the same carved alderwood smoking rack hook her great-grandmother had carried out of Bergen in 1895. Sigrid was tall and thin, with the long brown spotted hands of a lower Columbia River salmon woman, her white hair worn in a single tight braid, pinned at the back of her neck under a faded blue and white embroidered hardanger cotton kerchief. Linnea had called her Bestimore from the first day she could shape the sound. Linnea's mother, Eva, had gone to Portland when Linnea was 3 and had not come back, and Linnea's father, Tomas, had been lost off a gillnet boat on the Columbia Bar when she was 9, so the years had belonged to Bestimore from the time Linnea could carry a small cedar fish tote without spilling. She learned to tell a fresh-caught Columbia River Chinook from a coho by the rim of the operculum before she could read. By 8, she could draw a long alderwood smoking rack hook across a loose-laid cedar smoking room rack in a single slow, even pass without bruising a single fillet. By 12, she could read a smoking room. She could stand at her Bestimore's elbow at the open firebox door of the small brick smoking room firebox and see, before her Bestimore told her, whether a rack of split Chinook fillets had 2 more hours of slow drawing or 4, Whether the slow even draw through the long cedar smoking room flue was holding at the steady 86 degrees the cannery had always held, or whether the autumn river cold had drifted in through the loosened east cedar clapboard, and the next smoking would have to be moved to the lower rack, whether the small living wild Columbia River Chinook, Milt, and Roe culture, suspensions in the small glass jars under the smoking room planking were running true to the family line, or whether the long Washington winter had thinned the cultures and the suspensions needed a fresh setting in clean cold pilchuck slow water before the next spring. By 18 she had drawn her own salmon smoke for 4 full lower Columbia salmon runs, sealed 49 small glass jars of saved Columbia River wild Chinook, Milt, and Roe suspension, and pre-dam lower Columbia chum salmon roe behind the cedar planking in her own hand, and learned every one of the 17 Norwegian line cannery signs Bestemor said a Sorensen woman had to know before she was allowed to seal a jar of her own under her own initials. Bestemor, on a warm Saturday morning in October in Linnea's 18th year, walked out of the long low cedar smoking room of the cannery with a single deep amber slow-smoked Chinook fillet wrapped in clean cheesecloth, and laid it in Linnea's hands at the smoking room threshold, and said, "You are a Sorensen woman now. Venin min. The salmon knows you. The hook knows you. The smoking room knows you." And then she said, in her quiet way, "And there is one thing your Bestemor has not yet shown you, because the smoking room herself had to choose the morning. Come back to the inner smoking room with me." But before Linnea or Bestemor, there had been Ingeborg. Ingeborg Sorensen had come down off a Norwegian steamer at the port of Astoria in the autumn of 1895, 22 years old, with her young husband Anders Sorensen, a small wooden trunk holding everything they owned, and a single oilcloth-wrapped bundle holding the carved alderwood smoking rack hook her grandmother had handed her at the dock in Bergen. A small earthen crock of dried wild Hardanger Fjord salmon milt and Roe suspension her own mother had been refreshing with cool, clean fjord water every other week since 1843. A small leather pouch of saved Norwegian pre-blight smoking rack cedar shavings her own father had traded from an earlier Norwegian salmon woman in Bergen, and the rough plans for a lower Columbia River salmon cannery her grandmother had drawn out on a piece of brown butcher paper. The Sorensens had ridden the rails north from Astoria up the lower Washington shore of the Columbia in the spring of 1896, and they had stopped at a low cedar slough at the back end of a long, narrow road off the lower Columbia because the deep, clean tidal water of the Pilchuck Slough ran cool and dark the way the deep Hardanger Fjord water had run, and a small clear stream came down off the back ridge clean and cold over rounded basalt stones, and Ingeborg had stood at the edge of the slough on a warm April afternoon, and she had said to Anders, in the slow, careful English she was still learning, "This is the place. The cannery belongs here. We will not go further." She had been 22. She had no money to speak of, and no flock yet broken, and no one in the lower Columbia who believed a young Norwegian immigrant woman could build a working waterfront salmon cannery on a low cedar slough with her own 2 hands. But Ingeborg had set her hand on a fresh-shaped cedar corner post, and she had begun. She and Anders built the cannery through the spring and summer of 1896, hand-shaping the squared western red cedar corner posts of the long, low cannery floor, fitting the hand-pegged cedar floor planking of the long, low working room over hand-hewn for joists, raising the long, low cedar smoking room at the river end of the cannery against the slow bank, fitting the small brick smoking room firebox against the river wall of the inner smoking room, building the long pine sorting bench down the slow wall of the long, low working room, hand-cutting the cedar clapboard siding along the river face of the cannery, hanging a small hand-built oak threshold door on hand-forged iron strap hinges at the inner smoking room, and fitting a long cedar shake roof above. Ingeborg drew her first rack of slow-smoked Columbia River Chinook on the long cedar smoking room racks in October of 1896. She kept the cannery for 31 runs. She trained her daughter Astrid at her side, and Astrid trained her daughter Sigrid. And the cannery at Pilchuck Slough held its smoking room and its alderwood hook and its women without a single empty run for 31 years. Through Ingeborg and Astrid and Sigrid's mother until the autumn of 1963, when the last small commercial Pilchuck Slough salmon run failed in a single bad summer, and Sigrid's mother closed the oak threshold door of the inner smoking room on a cool October evening and walked back up to the small white painted clapboard. Cottage and the cannery did not open again for 62 years. Bestamore had 3 rules for the smoking room. The first was this: the slow draw is the teacher. You do not smoke the salmon ven and min. The slow, even 86-degree draw of cool alderwood smoke through the long cedar smoking room flue and the cool Pacific November air at the river vent smoke the salmon, and you only stand at the smoking room rack with the alderwood hook in your hands, and you read what the draw is telling you, and you do what it is asking. A cannery woman who thinks she decides when a rack of split Chinook will draw is a cannery woman who will scorch one rack in 3 and pull the next one off half-cured, because the slow draw will turn against her by the second rack. The second was this: the smoking room is the keeper. The squared western red cedar corner posts and the hand-pegged cedar floor, planking of the long low working room and the long low cedar smoking room, at the river end and the small brick firebox against the river wall and the long cedar shake roof and the hand-built oak threshold door of A. Working Lower Columbia Cannery are not a shed. They are a smoking place and a sorting place and a saving place for the salmon, all in one long, low waterfront building set on a low cedar slough. A cannery woman who thinks she smokes the family salmon in a backyard barrel is a cannery woman who is fooling herself. The smoking room is the keeper. The third was this: the roe is the family. The small saved wild Hardanger Fjord salmon milt in roe suspensions and the small saved pre-dam Lower Columbia chum salmon roe your great-great-grandmother carried out of Bergen in 1895 have been kept in small glass jars behind the hand-pegged cedar planking of the inner smoking room for 129 years, never once gone soft, never once gone foul, never once allowed to dry out in a careless summer. We refresh the suspension cultures with cool, clean Pilchuck Slough water 3 times a winter. We reseal each roe jar with a hand-pressed beeswax and cotton cloth lid. We never lift the jars from the cool alderwood dark of the chest unless the next Sorensen woman is at the smoking room rack learning to draw the smoke in her own hand. And when a Sorensen woman is gone, the next Sorensen woman lifts the cedar planking the same October morning, refreshes the suspension cultures in the same small earthen crock, and reseals the roe jars in her own hand. Mind the roe above the other 2. Ven and min. The cedar planking can be recut. The hook can be rubbed with beeswax. The roof can be reshaked. The wild Hardanger Fjord salmon milt and roe suspensions and the pre-dam Lower Columbia chum salmon roe cannot be replaced. Bestamore died in November of 2024 on a cold, rainy afternoon in her chair beside the small wood stove in the small white-painted clapboard cottage at the foot of Pilchuck Slough Road, with the open-thumbed cannery book in her lap and a small earthen crock of cool Pilchuck Slough water on the side table beside her. The doctor said it was her heart. Linnea was 18. She did not cry. She came home from her shift at the dock and found Bestamore in the chair, and she sat down on the rag rug floor beside the chair and laid her cheek against Bestamore's cool hand, and she stayed there until the funeral home came. She refreshed the suspension cultures herself that night, with a small ladle of cool, clean Pilchuck Slough water she had drawn off the back ridge stream in her own careful young hand, and only when the crock was set back on the cool corner of the kitchen counter did she sit down beside the cold wood stove and finally let herself cry. The small white-painted clapboard cottage at the foot of Pilchuck Slough Road belonged to the county, because Bestimore had taken a small reverse mortgage on it during her last sickness, and within 5 months of Bestimore's funeral, the county had come and asked Linnea to be out by the 1st of October. She had left with the small carved alderwood smoking shed key Bestimore had pressed into her hand on her last clear afternoon. The single-thumbed page torn carefully from Bestimore's Cannery book, sewn into the lining of her brown canvas barn coat pocket. The small earthen crock of cool, clean Pilchuck Slough water suspension cultures wrapped in 2 clean dish towels and a wool sweater, a small canvas bag of her clothes, and the photograph of 3 women standing at the oak threshold door of the inner smoking room in 1907. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small living thing in your family that someone tended for years on end? A culture, a starter, a saved jar in the dark that you carry with you from a woman who is no longer here. The half-mile walk down Pilchuck Slough Road from the small clapboard cottage to the low cedar slough at the back end was longer than she remembered, because the wide tidal slough opened slow and silver around her as she walked, and the late afternoon light came down soft and cool across the open slough water. The vine maple was flaming deep orange along the slough bank. A pair of great blue herons rose from the cedar bank and beat north on slow, steady wings. A small clear stream came down off the back ridge clean and cold over rounded basalt stones along the right of the road. She found the foundation of the small fish house first, 3 courses of basalt fieldstone in a square of new salmonberry cane, and beyond the foundation, set on the low cedar slough at the back end of the road under the open arc of a Pacific Northwest sky, the long low waterfront salmon cannery. 60 feet long at the long low working room, 20 feet wide at the inner smoking room at the river end, the cedar shake roof of the long low cannery collapsed slow along the east slope from 62 winters of Pacific rain. The hand-cut cedar clapboard siding silvered and split along the river face. A small hand-built oak threshold door at the river end of the inner smoking room, warped on hand-forged iron strap hinges rusted dark. A small rust-dark brick firebox chimney rising through the river slope of the smoking room roof gone cold, 62 autumns of dry vine maple leaves and dry salmonberry cane banked deep. Against the cedar threshold of the door, the long tidal slough stretching out behind the cannery to the deep cedar bank of the back ridge under the open arc of a deep slate Pacific Northwest sky. She did not cry. She brushed the dry vine maple leaves from the cedar threshold with her boot, fitted the small carved alderwood smoking shed key into the small hand-forged brass lock plate set into the oak door frame at hip height, worked the key gently for the better part of 2 minutes until the wards remembered how to turn, and then the bolt slid back with a small dry sound, and the oak threshold door of the inner smoking room eased open on its iron hinges with the slow groan of a door that has held shut for 62 winters. The cool, damp breath of the long, low working room came out to meet her first, the dim, warm cedar and salmon smell of oiled alderwood and old beeswax, and the faint, briny ghost of 129 years of slow-drawn Lower Columbia Chinook. She stood at the door a long minute. Then she lit her Bestimore's small brass kerosene lantern, and she stepped into the long, low working room. The long, low working room was 60 feet of slow, dim cedar warm air, the cedar clapboard walls cool and pale silver inside, the hand-pegged cedar floor planking worn smooth by 31 runs of bare and booted feet. The long cedar shake roof above her dark and partly collapsed along the east slope. A long pine sorting bench running down the slough wall. A small smoking rack-hook rack hung above the bench, with 3 hand-carved alderwood smoking rack hooks still in the rack gone dark with age. 3 half-filled cedar fish totes still on the sorting bench where Sigrid's mother had set them down in 1963. A small set of hand-pegged cedar steps leading up to the small inner smoking room at the river end of the cannery. But the whole working room around her, the long pine sorting bench and the cedar fish totes and the long cedar shake roof above, the whole building was falling apart. The cedar clapboard had silvered and split. The cedar shake roof had collapsed along the east slope. The rain of 62 Pacific winters had come slow through the east slope and rotted the lower planks of the long pine sorting bench dark to the slough wall. Only the small inner smoking room at the river end of the cannery, set behind its own hand-built oak threshold door on hand-forged iron strap hinges, looked entirely untouched, the cedar clapboard around it still tight and dry. The small brick firebox chimney still standing whole above its river slope of the roof, the small oak threshold door of the inner smoking room still set close against its frame. Sealed from the inside, the cool October evening Sigrid's mother had closed it for the last time. She climbed slowly up the hand-pegged cedar steps to the small oak threshold door of the inner smoking room at the river end of the cannery. She remembered, very clearly, a thing Bestamore had said one summer afternoon over coffee at the kitchen table in Pilchuck Slough when Linnea was 16. The good Sorensen canneries. Venin Min. We keep what is dearest pressed in oilcloth and packed in a hand-built alderwood chest behind the second-hand pegged cedar plank from the river wall of the inner smoking room in the cool alderwood dark of the smoking room cavity, because alderwood holds glass and roe against damp and river chill better than any cellar in any cottage. And no thief who has never drawn a long alderwood smoking rack hook across a loose laid cedar smoking room rack at first light in a cold October Pacific dawn would think to lift the cedar planking of an inner smoking room of a half-collapsed waterfront cannery and look for what a Sorensen woman has set down there. The small oak threshold door of the inner smoking room had been sealed from the inside. The hand-forged iron bolt of the door had been thrown across from the inside the night Sigrid's mother had walked out, and the small alderwood smoking shed key in Linnea's hand worked only the outer brass lock plate. For the better part of an hour, Linnea sat on the cedar threshold step with the small alderwood key in her closed palm. She tried the key in the outer brass plate again, and the bolt moved through the brass, but the inner iron bolt did not give. She set her open palm against the silvered oak, and she felt the cool damp of the smoking room cavity behind the door. She knelt on the worn cedar planking of the working room, and she fitted her fingers into the small dry gap between the bottom of the door and the cedar threshold, and she pulled, slow and steady. And the cedar threshold itself, hand-pegged loose by Bestamore's own hand on the last clear afternoon of her life, lifted up in Linnea's careful young hands. Beneath the cedar threshold, set into the cool alderwood dark of the smoking room cavity beneath the door, was the small hand-forged iron interior bolt, set into a small carved alderwood block, the head of the bolt-warm amber, with 129 years of being lifted by careful Sorensen hands. Linnea lifted the small iron bolt with the careful, slow, steady draw of an alderwood smoking rack hook across a loose-laid cedar rack at first light. The bolt drew slow back through the iron strap on the inside of the door. and the small oak threshold door of the inner smoking room, sealed from the inside on a cool October evening in 1963, eased open on its iron hinges with the slow groan of a smoking room door that has held shut for 62 winters, waiting for a Sorensen hand. The small inner smoking room was 12 feet on a side, the hand-pegged cedar planking of the four walls cool and warm dark, the long cedar smoking room racks worn smooth by 31 runs of slow-drawn Lower Columbia Chinook, the small brick firebox against the river wall with a single small bundle of dry alderwood kindling still laid in its firebox. A small hand-carved alderwood smoking rack hook leaning against the river wall where Sigrid's mother had set it down in 1963. A small finished cedar fish tote holding a thin scatter of deep amber slow-smoked Chinook from the last run still set on the worn cedar planking. The deep, dim, warm amber smell of 129 years of slow-drawn Lower Columbia Chinook held inside the small, cool, dry, sealed cedar cavity. She lifted the second-hand pegged cedar plank from the river wall, the one Bestamore had loosened on her own hand a long time before. Behind the plank, set into a shallow hollow of dry cedar shavings in the smoking room cavity, sealed in a long dark oilcloth bundle tied with weathered hemp twine, lay the alderwood chest. She lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than she had expected. She set the chest on the worn cedar planking and untied the hemp twine of the oilcloth slow with her fingers, and she opened the oilcloth fold by fold, and inside the hand-built alderwood chest, the lid carved on its top with 3 small joined letter S's. She lifted the lid, and inside, packed in a thin bed of dry cedar shavings and dry alderwood smoke-cured cotton, lay the jars, 49 of them. Small clean glass jars sealed with hand-pressed beeswax and cotton cloth lids tied with linen string, some holding small careful suspensions of saved wild Hardanger Fjord salmon milt and roe in pale amber dry suspension, some holding small careful suspensions of saved pre-dam Lower Columbia chum salmon roe in deep coral dry suspension. Each jar with a small slip of waxed paper tied to it with linen string carrying the year and the line and the woman's full name. Ingeborg, Hardanger Fjord Salmon Roe, 1896, first jar. Ingeborg, Lower Columbia Chum Salmon Roe, 1899. Ingeborg, Hardanger Fjord Salmon Milton Roe Refresh, 1904. Ingeborg, Lower Columbia Chum Salmon Roe, 1912. Astrid, Hardanger Fjord Salmon Roe, 1918, first jar under her own initials. Astrid, Lower Columbia Chum Salmon Roe, 1922. Astrid, Hardanger Fjord Salmon Milton Roe, 1925. Sigrid's mother, Hardanger Fjord Salmon Roe, September 1963. The last jar sealed in the smoking room cavity before the run had failed and the oak threshold door had closed for 62 winters. The slow Norwegian line cannery keeping of 3 generations of women, sealed in glass and dry cedar shavings, in a hand-built alderwood chest behind the cedar planking of a Lower Columbia salmon cannery for 129 years. Beneath the jars, in the cool alderwood dark of the chest, lay a small flat tin box with a hinged lid and a small leather pouch. Linnea lifted the tin. Inside was the original cannery book, thick, sewn together with linen thread, the cover of soft-tanned oilskin, the pages of cotton paper hand-cut and hand-ruled, and on every page, in the careful old hands of 3 generations of Sorensen women, was the whole record of the cannery. The run day, the Chinook weight, the rack load, the firebox draw temperature, the hook pass, the smoke hour, the row suspension refresh, the wax lid seal. Page after page after page, 129 years of careful Norwegian line, Lower Columbia cannery keeping. Inside the small leather pouch lay 19 small American gold coins, $5 pieces from the 1870s and 80s, the gold Ingeborg had carried out of Bergen in the lining of her coat. And folded into the back of the Cannery book, sealed with a drop of warm, dark beeswax gone hard as amber, was a single letter, the wax still whole, addressed in long, careful old Norwegian-tinged penmanship to the granddaughter who lifts the cedar plank. From Ingeborg Sorensen, Laxerker, Pilchuk Slav, 1898. She broke the wax seal with her thumb and read the letter aloud to the small inner smoking room because there was no one else to read it to, and the slow, dim jars were the only thing listening. To the granddaughter who lifts the cedar plank. If you are reading this, you have walked down Pilchuk Slav Road with a small alderwood smoking. Shed key in your hand, and you have brushed the vine maple leaves from the cedar threshold, and you have lifted the cedar threshold beneath the door, and you have drawn the hand-forged iron interior bolt slow back. Through the iron strap, and you are a Sorensen woman, and the smoking room has called you home. My name is Ingeborg Sorensen. I was born Ingeborg Liane on a small Hardanger Fjord salmon weir outside Bergen in the autumn of 1873, the eldest of 4 daughters of a Hardanger salmon fisher and a smoking room woman, and the only one my grandmother taught the alderwood hook and the cedar smoking room rack and the saved row, because I was the only one who would sit still long enough to learn to listen to the slow draw. I came across the ocean with my husband Anders in the autumn of 1895 with a small oilcloth bundle of the carved alderwood hook and the dried Hardanger salmon milt and roe suspensions and the saved lower Columbia chum salmon roe and the rough plans my grandmother had drawn. Out on a piece of brown butcher paper, I rode the rails north from Astoria up the lower Washington shore of the Columbia in the spring of 1896, and I stood at the edge of this low cedar slough on a warm April afternoon, and I knew, the way a woman knows a thing once and keeps it for 50 years, that the cannery was here. I built this lower Columbia salmon cannery with my own 2 hands and Anders's across the spring and summer of 1896, and I drew my first rack of slow-smoked Columbia River Chinook on the long cedar smoking room racks in October, and I sealed my first jar of Hardanger Fjord salmon roe and lower Columbia chum salmon roe behind the cedar planking of the inner smoking room in November. The jars in the alderwood chest below this letter, Ven and Min, are not money. They are not gold. They are the family. The cedar shake roof can be reshaked. The hook can be rubbed with beeswax. The clapboard can be recut. The cedar planking can be repegged. The wild Hardanger Fjord salmon milt and roe suspensions and the pre-dam lower Columbia chum salmon roe, refreshed once with cool, clean slough water and sealed once in glass, are the family kept in alderwood and cedar shavings and the slow Pacific dark. The gold in the pouch is the small gold I carried across the ocean, and I trust you will not spend it for any reason other than to mend this cedar shake roof or recut this clapboard or buy fresh clean cotton cloth from an Ilwaco store in a year your own seal runs thin. Do not move the jars. Do not unseal the wax lids unless you mean to set the suspension in a clean, cool slough water roe. Do not be greedy with the jars in the chest. Lift 1 jar to the Wusu salmon genetics researcher who comes asking after pre-dam lower Columbia chum salmon bloodlines, and lay the rest of the jars in the alderwood chest the way you found them, and close the oak threshold door at sundown the way a Sorensen woman has closed the door of this smoking room at sundown for 31 runs. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Ingeborg Sorensen, Laxerker, Pilchuk Slough, Pacific County, Washington, the 14th of October, 1898. Linnea laid the letter flat on the worn cedar planking. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool cedar and salmon smell of the small inner smoking room and the faint warm amber ghost of 129 years of slow-drawn Lower Columbia Chinook. And the tight thing that had lived in her chest since the cold November afternoon she had walked into Bestamore's kitchen loosened. The name of the loosening was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a careful coin dealer in Astoria the following week. A man named Mr. Lars Bjornstad, who valued the 19 small $5 gold pieces at $42,800. She sold 5 of them. She put $11,000 in a savings account at the Pacific County Bank, and she walked back down Pilchuck Slough Road with a fresh load of cedar shakes for the east slope of the roof, 2 coils of new hemp twine, a small bag of fresh clean cotton cloth from an Ilwaco store, a fresh cake of beeswax, and a small can of new kerosene for Bestamore's lantern. She did not move the jars. The jars stayed where Ingeborg and Astrid and Sigrid's mother had sealed them, in the cool alderwood dark of the chest behind the cedar planking of the inner smoking room. But she did, that first October, walk down off the cedar threshold with a single, small, deep amber, slow-smoked Chinook fillet wrapped in clean cheesecloth to the older women of Pilchuck Slough and Ilwaco. Mrs. Astrid Halvorsen, 87, who had been a girl when Ingeborg drew her last rack. Mrs. Marit Bergstrom, 83, whose grandmother had been Ingeborg's first Cannery customer. Each one took the small, deep amber fillet in their old hands and looked at it for a long time. Each one said the same thing, in some form. We had begun to wonder if any of you would come back. And in the early spring, an older woman drove down the slow road from the Washington State University Salmon Genetics Research Program, who had been searching for 30 years for surviving pre-dam Lower Columbia chum salmon bloodlines presumed extinct since the dam closures, and she stood in the open oak threshold door of the inner smoking room on a warm March afternoon with her hand against her mouth, looking at the rows of small glass jars of saved pre-dam Lower Columbia chum salmon roe under the lantern amber, and she said only, "Please, Venin Min. Please let me come back with the lab." That is the thing about the salmon keeping our grandmothers teach us, the slow kind. The kind we learn at a long cedar smoking room rack with a carved alderwood hook when we are 3 years old. It is not really about the fillet. The fillet is the wage. The roe is the trade. The trade is the small jars, sealed in dry cedar shavings, in a hand-built alderwood chest behind the cedar planking of a Lower Columbia salmon cannery for 129 years, and the slow, steady draw of cool alderwood smoke through a long cedar smoking room flue at first light in a cold October Pacific dawn, and the small earthen crock of cool, clean slock water rose suspensions set on the cool corner of a kitchen counter and refreshed by a Sorensen hand every other week for 129 years. The trade is, above all, the truth Ingeborg wrote in her letter on the 14th of October, 1898. The roe is the family. The smoking room is the keeper. The slow draw is the teacher. We are only the next pair of hands. Linnea Sorensen was 19 years old and evicted. She had $7 to her name, and she spent them on a half-collapsed waterfront salmon cannery on Pilchuck Slough Road in Pilchuck Slough in Pacific County, Washington. It was the best $7 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us. Sleep well, breathe easy, and see you in the last warm light of the day.